In the heart of ancient Rome, long before emperors ruled from marble palaces and legions stretched the empire to the edge of the known world, there burned a single flame that was believed to hold the fate of the city itself. This was the sacred fire of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, home, and continuity. As long as that fire burned, Rome would endure. If it went out, disaster, military defeat, famine, or divine abandonment was thought to be inevitable. Guarding this flame were not soldiers, senators, or kings, but a small group of women known as the Vestal Virgins. They were among the most powerful religious figures in Roman society, yet also among the most vulnerable. To understand why Vestal Virgins were both revered and feared, one must first grasp how deeply religion and superstition were woven into Roman life. Rome did not separate faith from politics or daily routine. Every public act, declaring war, electing officials, even opening the Senate, required divine approval. The gods were not distant beings, they were active forces who could be angered, bribed, or appeased. Among these gods, Vesta occupied a unique position. She had no elaborate myths or dramatic love affairs like Venus or Mars. Her power was quieter but more fundamental. She represented stability, continuity, and the survival of the Roman state itself. The Vestal Virgins were believed to be living embodiments of this stability. Chosen as young girls, typically between the ages of 6 and 10, they were taken from their families and inducted into a 30-year service to the goddess. For the Romans, this sacrifice was immense, but so was the honor. A daughter chosen as a Vestal elevated her entire family's status. Fathers gained prestige, brothers benefited politically, and the family name was forever tied to Rome's divine protection. Once inducted, a Vestal Virgin ceased to belong to her family and became, in a sense, a daughter of the state. She lived in the house of the Vestals in the Roman Forum, directly beside the Temple of Vesta. This location was no accident. The Forum was the political and spiritual center of Rome, and the Vestals stood at its core, silently reinforcing the belief that Rome's power flowed from divine favor. Their most critical duty was tending the sacred fire. Day and night, without interruption, the flame had to be maintained. If it went out, even by accident, it was interpreted as a terrible omen. The Vestal responsible would be publicly whipped by the Pontifex Maximus, the highest religious authority in Rome, often under cover of darkness to avoid further angering the gods. This punishment alone reveals how terrifying their responsibility was. A simple mistake could be seen as a sign that Rome itself was in danger, but the Vestals were far more than ceremonial firekeepers. They were entrusted with sacred objects that few others were allowed to see, including relics believed to be essential to Rome's destiny. Some ancient sources claim they guarded the Palladium, a divine statue said to ensure Rome's invincibility. Whether myth or reality, the belief mattered. The Vestals were considered the last line of defense between Rome and chaos. Their social privileges reflected this extraordinary role. Unlike other Roman women, Vestal Virgins were legally independent. They did not fall under the authority of a father or husband. They could own property, make wills, and manage wealth, rights unheard of for most women in antiquity. In public, they were accompanied by lictors, officials who normally escorted high-ranking magistrates. If a condemned prisoner encountered a Vestal by chance, his execution could be postponed or even cancelled, as her presence was interpreted as a sign of divine mercy. And yet, this reverence came with an undercurrent of fear. The Vestals were not just holy, they were dangerously holy. Their purity was believed to be directly linked to Rome's safety. If a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, it was not merely a personal failing, it was a cosmic threat. Romans believed that such an act polluted the city and angered the gods, inviting catastrophe. This belief made Vestals powerful symbols, but also convenient scapegoats. During times of crisis, military defeats, plagues, political unrest, Romans searched desperately for explanations. Often, suspicion fell upon the Vestals. If the gods were angry, someone must be to blame. An impure Vestal provided an answer that was both religiously satisfying and politically useful. The fear surrounding Vestals also stemmed from their liminal status. They were neither wives nor daughters, neither fully private nor fully public figures. They lived outside the normal social order, bound by rules that set them apart from all other women. Romans viewed this separation as sacred, but also unsettling. Anything that exists outside the norm carries a certain danger, and the Vestals were no exception. Ancient writers often describe the Vestals with a mix of awe and anxiety. They were praised for their dignity, discipline, and restraint, yet constantly scrutinized. A misplaced glance, a rumor, or an enemy's accusation could trigger investigations into their conduct. Their lives were lived under permanent observation, their virtue assumed but never fully trusted. This duality, reverence and suspicion, defined the Vestal Virgins' existence. They were honored as protectors of Rome, walking symbols of divine favor, yet feared as potential harbingers of doom. The same society that granted them extraordinary privileges also imposed the most horrific punishments imaginable if they were believed to have failed. In the end, the Vestal Virgins embodied Rome's deepest contradiction, a civilization obsessed with order, control, and divine approval, yet driven by paranoia and fear of the Unk. Noun. To revere them was to believe in Rome's destiny. To fear them was to acknowledge how fragile that destiny truly was. The moment a girl was chosen to become a Vestal Virgin, her life as an ordinary Roman child ended forever. Unlike most religious callings, this was not a path entered willingly as an adult. It was a decision imposed upon very young girls, typically between 6 and 10 years old, who could not possibly understand the weight of what was being taken from them. To the Roman state, this was a necessary sacrifice. To the families involved, it was both a supreme honor and a quiet tragedy. Selection into the Vestal Order was governed by strict rules designed to ensure ritual perfection. The girl had to be born of 2 living parents, free of physical or mental defects, and from a family of respectable social standing. Originally, only daughters of patrician families were eligible, but over time wealthy plebeian families were also considered. The emphasis was not simply on nobility but on purity, social, physical, and symbolic. A flawed body or unstable family background was believed to offend the gods. The final choice was made by the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's highest religious authority. Ancient sources describe the selection as a public event, held in the Forum, where eligible girls were gathered before the crowd. The Pontifex would then choose one, sometimes by drawing lots, sometimes by deliberate decision. When the chosen child's name was called, she was taken immediately, often without warning. Roman law granted the Pontifex the legal right to remove her from her father's household, even if her parents protested. This moment marked a ritual death of her former identity. The girl was no longer under her father's authority and ceased to belong fully to her biological family. In Roman legal terms, she became sui iuris, independent, a status no other child could possess. Symbolically, she was reborn as a servant of Vesta and a living asset of the Roman state. The initiation ceremony reinforced this transformation. Her hair was cut and dedicated to a sacred tree, a powerful symbol of separation from childhood and fertility. She exchanged her ordinary clothing for the distinctive white robes of a Vestal Virgin and received her new title. From that day forward, she was expected to embody discipline, silence, and absolute obedience to ritual law. Her service was divided into 3 stages, each lasting 10 years. During the first decade, she was a novice, learning the sacred rites, prayers, and strict codes of conduct. Mistakes were not tolerated easily, for ignorance was no excuse when the fate of Rome was believed to be at stake. The second decade was the height of her power and responsibility. She actively tended the sacred flame, participated in major state rituals, and guarded Rome's most sacred objects. The final decade was spent training younger Vestals, passing on knowledge that had been transmitted, unchanged for centuries. Our years was an eternity by ancient standards. By the time a Vestal completed her service, she was often in her late 30s or 40s, an age by which most Roman women had raised families and secured their place in society. In theory, a retired Vestal was free to marry. In practice, very few did. Years of isolation, Ritual discipline and the psychological weight of their role made reintegration into normal life difficult. Many chose to remain within the Vestal household for the rest of their lives. Life inside the House of the Vestals was a strange mix of privilege and confinement. The Vestals lived in relative luxury, with servants, fine food, and prominent living quarters near the Forum. They were educated, literate, and socially respected. Yet their daily existence was governed by relentless routine. Every movement, every word, every gesture was regulated. They could not attend public events freely, form personal relationships, or express individuality in ways other women might. The most defining restriction was their vow of absolute chastity. Unlike Greek priestesses, who often served temporarily, Vestals were bound for decades. Sexual purity was not merely symbolic, it was believed to be the physical manifestation of Rome's moral and cosmic order. A Vestal's body was seen as a vessel for the city's safety. Any violation of that body threatened the entire state. This belief placed an unbearable psychological burden on children who had been chosen before they could see. On scent. From an early age, Vestals were taught that their thoughts, dreams, and emotions were dangerous if left unchecked. Desire was not just sinful, it was treason against Rome itself. Fear, guilt, and self-surveillance became ingrained habits. Despite their elevated status, Vestals lived under constant suspicion. Their isolation did not protect them from rumor, it amplified it. Any unusual behavior, illness, or coincidence could provoke scrutiny. Political enemies sometimes exploited this vulnerability, using accusations against Vestals to destabilize rivals or divert public anger during crises. What makes the selection of Vestal Virgins particularly disturbing is how completely it erased personal choice. These girls did not volunteer, they were claimed. The Roman state justified this act by framing it as divine will, yet the human cost was immense. Childhood, family bonds, motherhood, and personal freedom were all surrendered for the illusion of collective security. In Roman ideology, the Vestal Virgin was the ultimate symbol of self-sacrifice. She was praised as the purest woman in the city, yet denied the fundamental experiences that defined womanhood in Roman society. She existed not for herself, but as a living guarantee that Rome would continue. The tragedy of the Vestals lies not only in the punishments they faced if they failed, but in the fact that their lives were decided long before failure was even possible. Chosen as children, bound for life, they stood as silent pillars of a civilization that demanded absolute devotion and offered survival, but never freedom in ancient Rome. The purity of the Vestal Virgins was not merely a religious concern, it was a matter of state security. The Romans believed that the moral condition of these women directly affected the favor of the gods and, by extension, the survival of the Republic and later the Empire. This belief transformed the Vestal's chastity into a powerful symbol, one that could be manipulated, weaponized, and ultimately turned against them. When accusations of impurity arose, they were rarely just about religion. They were about fear, power, and control. The charge most dreaded by a Vestal was incestum, a term that did not simply mean sexual misconduct, but a sacred pollution so severe it threatened Rome itself. Unlike ordinary crimes, incestum was not judged as a private act between individuals. It was a cosmic violation. If a Vestal was believed to have broken her vow of chastity, Romans assumed that the gods would withdraw their protection. Earthquakes, military defeats, floods, plagues, any disaster could suddenly be reinterpreted as proof that a Vestal had failed. This made Vestals uniquely vulnerable during times of crisis. When Rome suffered humiliating defeats or unexplained calamities, the population demanded answers. The gods had to be appeased, and appeasement required identifying guilt. Vestal Virgins, whose purity was believed to hold Rome together, became natural targets. Their bodies symbolized the state, and punishing them was seen as a way to cleanse the city. Accusations often began as whispers. A Vestal seen speaking too freely with a man, a rumor of secret meetings, or even a dream interpreted by a priest could spark suspicion. Unlike modern legal systems, Roman religious trials did not require physical evidence. Divine signs, omens, and testimonies from political authorities carried more weight than facts. Once suspicion took hold, innocence became nearly impossible to prove. The authority to investigate and judge Vestals belonged to the Pontifex Maximus, a role that combined immense religious power with political influence. In theory, this safeguarded the Vestals from mob justice. In reality, it placed their lives in the hands of men who were deeply embedded in Rome's political struggles. A pontifex with enemies might find it convenient to accuse a Vestal connected to a rival family. A public execution of a Vestal could distract the population from military failure or economic hardship. History records several waves of Vestal accusations that coincided suspiciously with national disasters. After Rome's crushing defeat at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, panic swept the city. The loss was so catastrophic that Romans believed the gods had turned against them. Soon after, Vestals were accused of impurity, tried, and executed. Their death served as a grim reassurance. Rome had identified the cause of divine anger and taken act. Ion. What makes these trials especially disturbing is the imbalance of power. Vestals were sworn to silence, trained in obedience, and isolated from public life. They lacked political allies who could openly defend them. Even when accused men, often Roman knights or officials, were implicated alongside them, the punishment fell most heavily on the Vestals. The men were typically beaten or exiled, the Vestals paid with their lives. Fear played a central role in these proceedings. Romans genuinely believed that sparing a guilty Vestal would doom the city. Mercy, in this context, was viewed as cowardice. The execution of a Vestal became a ritual of purification, a public demonstration that Rome was willing to sacrifice even its most sacred figures to restore cosmic balance. Yet not all accusations were sincere acts of religious devotion. Some were transparently political. During periods of intense factional rivalry, Vestals connected by blood or patronage to certain elites became strategic targets. An accusation against a Vestal could disgrace an entire family, weaken alliances, and shift public opinion. Because Vestals were legally independent, their downfall could not easily be deflected by family intervention. The terrifying paradox was this: the more sacred a Vestal was believed to be, the more dangerous her alleged corruption became. Her elevated status magnified the perceived threat. A common woman's misconduct was a private sin. A Vestal's misconduct was treason against the gods. Once accused, the process moved quickly. Investigations were secretive. Confessions were sometimes extracted under psychological pressure. Omens were consulted, not to discover truth, but to confirm what authorities already believed. If a Vestal was declared guilty, her fate was sealed. There was no appeal, no exile, no chance at redemption. This system created an atmosphere of constant terror within the Vestal household. Every Vestal knew that obedience was not enough. She had to be beyond suspicion, beyond rumor, beyond misinterpretation. Even illness or emotional distress could be seen as signs of hidden guilt. The fear was not only of punishment, but of becoming a symbol, of being turned into Rome's scapegoat. The tragedy of these accusations lies in their inevitability. In a society that demanded divine explanations for human failure, someone had to pay. Vestal Virgins, revered yet isolated, powerful yet defenseless, were perfectly positioned to absorb collective guilt. Their deaths reassured Rome that order had been restored, even as injustice went unexamined. In the end, the accusation of impurity against a Vestal Virgin reveals a darker truth about Roman society. Sacred purity was not only a spiritual ideal, it was a tool, a weapon wielded by a state desperate to control fear, maintain authority, and convince itself that disaster could be prevented as long as the right sacrifice was made. Among all the punishments devised by ancient Rome, none was more lean, more ritualized, or more psychologically brutal than the fate reserved for a Vestal Virgin found guilty of incestum. Unlike traitors who were beheaded or criminals who were crucified, a condemned Vestal was buried alive, not as an act of rage, but as a cold, methodical ceremony performed in the name of religion. This punishment was not meant to kill her directly. It was designed to absolve Rome of guilt while ensuring her death occurred slowly, invisibly, and in silence. The Romans faced a theological problem when dealing with a defiled Vestal. Because she was sacred, her blood could not be shed. To execute her openly would itself be an act of sacrilege, compounding the pollution Rome was trying to erase. The solution was a legal and religious loophole. The Vestal would not be executed by Rome. Instead, she would be placed underground and left to the will of the gods. Her death, though inevitable, would be technically natural. The location chosen for this punishment was the Campus Celeratus, the field of evil deeds, just outside Rome's sacred boundary, the Pomerium. This was a deliberate choice. The Vestal could not die within the holy limits of the city she had polluted, but she also could not be cast away like a common criminal. The boundary zone reflected her liminal status, no longer sacred, but not fully profane. The execution itself was carried out with grim precision. On the appointed day, Rome would fall into an uneasy silence. Unlike public executions meant to entertain or intimidate, this was a somber ritual. The condemned Vestal was dressed in funeral garments and led through the city, often in a closed litter to shield her from public view. Crowds gathered nonetheless, not to cheer, but to watch in terrified reverence. Ancient sources describe the procession as one of the most haunting sights in Rome. No chains were used, no blows were struck. The Vestal walked freely, a final, cruel reminder that she was still considered sacred enough to be treated gently, yet not sacred enough to be spared. Priests offered prayers, not for her salvation, but for Rome's purification. The emphasis was never on her suffering. It was on restoring cosmic balance. At the burial site, a small underground chamber had already been prepared. It contained minimal provisions, a lamp, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, sometimes milk or oil. These items were not meant to sustain life. They existed solely to preserve the illusion that Rome was not directly killing her. Once she descended into the chamber, the entrance was sealed with earth and stone. At that moment the ritual ended. No witnesses remained, no prayers followed. The Vestal's name was erased from public memory. Rome moved on. What happened next was never spoken of openly, but everyone understood. Alone in the dark, the condemned Vestal faced hours or days of slow death. Some likely succumbed to suffocation as oxygen dwindled. Others may have starved or dehydrated, fully conscious of their fate. There was no escape, no chance of rescue, no one to hear their cries. This silence was not incidental, it was essential. Silence protected Rome's conscience. By refusing to witness the death, Romans avoided confronting the brutality of their justice. The gods, not the state, were blamed for the outcome. This allowed Rome to maintain its image as a pious civilization while committing an act that, by any moral standard, was torture. The psychological terror of this punishment extended far beyond the individual victim. Every Vestal Virgin knew exactly how she would die if accused. The image of the underground chamber haunted their daily rituals. It reinforced obedience through fear more effectively than any law or threat could. Chastity was no longer just a vow, it was survival. What makes this punishment especially disturbing is that guilt was not always certain. Some Vestals may have been innocent, victims of rumor, politics, or collective panic. Once condemned, truth no longer mattered. The ritual required a sacrifice, not justice. Ancient writers rarely linger on the emotional experience of the condemned Vestal. This absence is telling. Roman history records laws, omens, and outcomes, but not screams, tears, or terror. The humanity of the victim was deliberately erased. She ceased to be a person and became a symbol of corruption that had to be removed. In this way, the burial alive of Vestal Virgins reveals one of the darkest aspects of Roman religion, the willingness to dehumanize individuals for the sake of collective reassurance. The punishment was not an accident of cruelty, it was a carefully designed system that balanced superstition, legal fiction, and political necessity. Rome prided itself on order, discipline, and rational governance. Yet beneath this facade lay rituals driven by fear of divine wrath and the need for control. The buried Vestal was the ultimate price of that fear, a living woman sacrificed so the city could believe itself clean again. The horror of the Campus Celeratus is not just that women were buried alive. It is that an entire civilization accepted this act as necessary, just, and even merciful. In the name of the gods, Rome silenced its most sacred daughters. and taught the survivors that obedience was the only path that did not end underground. The story of the Vestal Virgins is often framed as a tale of religious devotion and sacred duty, but beneath that surface lies a far more unsettling truth. The fate of the Vestals exposes the psychological machinery that powered Roman society, one built on fear of disorder, obsession with control, and a deep paranoia about divine judgment. Through the lives and deaths of these women, Rome revealed not its strength, but its anxieties. At its core, Rome was a civilization terrified of chaos. From its earliest myths, Roman identity revolved around survival against overwhelming odds. Civil wars, invasions, plagues, and natural disasters were not distant memories but recurring threats. To make sense of this instability, Romans developed an elaborate religious system designed to manage fear. Rituals, omens, sacrifices, and priesthoods offered the illusion that chaos could be controlled if the gods were properly appeased. The Vestal Virgins sat at the center of this system. Their bodies became symbolic anchors of order. As long as they remained pure, Rome believed itself protected. This belief shifted an abstract fear, the unpredictability of the world, onto a small, controllable group of individuals. Rather than confronting military failures or political corruption, Romans could reassure themselves that stability depended on ritual compliance. This is where power enters the equation. By tying the fate of the state to the chastity of the Vestals, Rome concentrated enormous symbolic power in the hands of religious and political authorities. The Pontifex Maximus and ruling elites became interpreters of divine will. They decided when purity was intact and when it had been violated. This authority was not passive, it was actively exercised during moments of crisis. Paranoia intensified this dynamic. When Rome suffered setbacks, suspicion spread quickly. Someone must have angered the gods. Someone must be responsible. In such an atmosphere, rational explanations mattered less than emotional reassurance. Accusing a Vestal offered a simple narrative. Rome was not weak, it had been betrayed from within. Punishment restored order, at least psychologically. The Vestals themselves had little defense against this paranoia. Their elevated status isolated them. They were admired, but not trusted, revered, but never fully humanized. This made them ideal vessels for collective anxiety. When things went wrong, sacrificing a Vestal felt easier than confronting systemic failure. Control was maintained not only through punishment, but through spectacle and silence. Although the execution of a Vestal was technically hidden from public view, the ritual surrounding it was deeply symbolic. The slow procession, the solemn prayers, the carefully chosen burial site, all communicated a clear message: Rome would do whatever was necessary to preserve order. This message extended beyond the Vestals to the wider population. If Rome could bury alive its most sacred women, what hope did ordinary citizens have of escaping state power? The punishment reinforced obedience at every level of society. Fear became a tool of governance. The gendered nature of this system cannot be ignored. Vestal Virgins were praised as ideals of feminine virtue, yet stripped of autonomy. Their worth was measured almost entirely through their bodies. Male priests and officials defined purity, judged guilt, and carried out punishment. Female sanctity existed only under male control. This imbalance reveals how Roman morality functioned less as a spiritual code and more as a mechanism of domination. Ironically, the same system that demanded absolute purity from Vestals tolerated widespread sexual exploitation elsewhere in Roman society. Prostitution was legal. Enslaved women had no sexual protection. Elite men faced few consequences for misconduct. Purity was enforced selectively, not universally. It was symbolic, not moral. This hypocrisy exposes the true function of the Vestal system. It was never about ethical behavior. It was about containment. By isolating purity within a small group of women, Rome created a manageable focal point for religious anxiety. The Vestals absorbed the moral burden of the entire city. Even the privileges granted to Vestals, wealth, legal independence, public honor, served this purpose. They elevated the Vestals just enough to make their fall meaningful. A punished Vestal was not merely a criminal, she was a sacred pillar brought crashing down. Her death carried symbolic weight precisely because she had been placed so high. As Rome evolved from republic to empire, the Vestal institution endured, not because it was humane or rational, but because it was useful. Emperors recognized its propaganda value. Associating themselves with the Vestals signaled divine approval. Preserving ancient rituals reassured a population anxious about change. Tradition became a stabilizing myth. Yet over time, skepticism grew. As philosophical thought expanded and Christianity rose, the logic of the Vestal system began to erode. The idea that a city's fate depended on the chastity of a few women seemed increasingly implausible. When the Vestal Order was finally dissolved in the late 4th century CE, there was no dramatic collapse of Rome's fortunes. The gods did not strike the city down. The sacred fire went out, and the world continued. This quiet ending is perhaps the most revealing detail of all. It exposes the Vestal system for what it truly was, a human invention, sustained by fear and belief, not divine necessity. The fate of the Vestal Virgins forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about power. Societies often preserve stability not by justice, but by sacrifice. They choose symbols to carry their anxieties, punish them when fear demands it, and call the result order. In Rome, those symbols were young girls taken from their families, trained to suppress their humanity, and condemned to die in silence if suspicion arose. Their story is not just a relic of ancient cruelty, it is a warning about what happens when control, paranoia, and power outweigh compassion, and when a civilization convinces itself that survival requires someone else to be buried alive.